Welcome to Justice Reloaded HD. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask you something. Have you ever placed your hand on a dog's back and felt your fears quiet down, just for a moment? There's something about the warmth of a heartbeat under soft fur that reminds us we're not alone. But for one little boy, even getting close to that moment took everything he had. Today's story isn't just about petting a dog, it's about learning to trust again, daring to reach out, and discovering that healing often begins with someone simply choosing to stay by your side when you're scared. If you believe that gentle moments can change a life, if you've ever seen love shine brightest in the quietest acts, then go ahead and tap like and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Because every week, we bring you true stories that remind the world what kindness can do. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Spokane, Washington. The kind of morning where the lake barely moved and the sky wore a soft blue like it had nothing to prove. Along the edge of the water, a small lakeside diner sat tucked beneath hanging lights and flower baskets, its outdoor tables welcoming locals, travelers, and their four-legged companions. Edward Wallace didn't usually dine in places like this. The billionaire transportation mogul had a preference for structure, places with reservations, valet parking, and no unexpected variables. But he'd heard the food was good, and more importantly, it was one of the few places his 8-year-old son Ben hadn't yet formed a rigid association with. So he gave it a try. Ben gripped his father's hand tighter the moment they stepped onto the patio. He was small for his age, with wide eyes that darted in all directions. Sensory processing disorder, the doctors had called it. What it meant in real life was that loud sounds, unpredictable movements, even certain textures, like dog fur, could send Ben into a tailspin of fear. Years ago, a neighbor's dog had barked just a little too close, and since then, even the jingle of a collar could make him panic. They were just settling at their table when she appeared, Sophie Rivera, the waitress with warm eyes and a calm that felt like it came from another world. She wore her hair pulled back in a loose scarf and moved like someone who knew how to read a room, even without saying a word. But it wasn't Sophie that Ben noticed first. It was the dog. A tiny caramel-colored pup sat obediently by her side, wearing a little yellow bandana around its neck. The dog didn't bark, didn't move, just looked up with round, polite eyes. Ben froze. His knees pulled up to his chest, arms wrapping tight around them as he slid down in his seat. His breathing quickened. Edward immediately reached for his son, ready to lift him up and leave without another word. But Sophie crouched down before either of them could speak. "It's okay," she said gently, her voice soft like the breeze brushing over the lake. "This is Peanut. He's trained not to come close unless he's invited. He won't move unless you tell him to." Ben said nothing. His eyes stayed locked on the dog. Edward gave Sophie a guarded glance, as if to say we've been through this before, but she wasn't finished. She reached into her apron and pulled out a napkin, setting it gently on the table. Then she offered Ben a pen. "How about this?" she whispered, as if sharing a secret only for him. "If you draw a circle on this napkin, just any kind of circle, I'll place a treat for Peanut inside. He'll know that's his waiting spot. He'll stay put until you say otherwise. I promise." Ben hesitated. Then, with shaky hands, he took the pen. The circle he drew was more of a lopsided cloud than anything else, but Sophie didn't comment. She just smiled, pulled a small biscuit from her pocket, and placed it delicately inside the drawn line. Peanut didn't move, only blinked and tilted his head, as if saying, "Okay, I'll wait here." For the first time in a long time, Ben didn't run. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply stared at the circle, at the dog, then up at the woman who had knelt at his eye level and invited him, not to be brave, but just to try. And for one flickering second, Ben looked at Peanut, not with terror, but with curiosity. That night, long after the last table had been cleared and the last glass had been wiped dry, Sophie Rivera found a note tucked beneath the edge of a sugar caddy on table 9, the one by the railing where the man in the suit had sat with a boy who wouldn't look anyone in the eye. The handwriting was strong, angled, almost military in its precision. My son has never stayed near a dog that long. Not ever. I'd like to ask if you'd consider helping him. Learn to be around one. Edward Wallace. Sophie stared at the words for a long time. The note wasn't signed with money, or with some high-and-mighty business card. It wasn't a command. It was a request. And it rattled something deep in her she hadn't touched in years. Before this job, before the aprons, before Peanut, she had once stood in front of classrooms filled with kids just like Ben. Children with trembling hands and startled hearts. She'd been a volunteer trainer at a therapy dog center outside Yakima, where every day she helped dogs become bridges between fear and connection. It had been her joy. Her purpose. Until the accident. One of the dogs, a beautiful stubborn husky named Duke, had slipped his lead during a session. Her little sister Maya, just 10 at the time, had run to catch him, and ended up with 15 stitches down her arm and a scar that never fully faded. Sophie had never trained another dog after that. She'd closed that chapter. Or so she thought. The next morning, Sophie arrived at the diner earlier than usual, Peanut trotting beside her with his usual bright bandana fluttering at his neck. She hadn't responded to the note. Didn't know what she would say if the man returned. But when she rounded the corner toward the patio, her breath caught. Ben was already there. Alone. Well, not exactly alone. A quiet woman, likely a nanny, sat nearby at another table, sipping tea and watching him from a respectful distance. But Ben himself stood by the table, waiting. In his hands was something small and carefully wrapped in wax paper, crinkled at the edges like he'd folded and unfolded it a dozen times on the ride over. He didn't look up when Sophie approached. Just held out the bundle in both hands and said, barely above a whisper, "It's for Peanut. If he still stays in the circle." Sophie paused. She hadn't expected this, not from the father, not from the boy, and certainly not from herself. She took the small parcel and opened it gently. Inside was a dog biscuit, shaped like a bone, with just the faintest trace of icing, a treat from a bakery down the street that Sophie knew didn't come cheap. Ben didn't flinch when she stepped closer. He just watched as she knelt beside Peanut, drew a new circle on a fresh napkin, and set the biscuit inside. Peanut, as always, waited patiently, his eyes soft and trusting. Sophie glanced up at Ben. His gaze was fixed, not on the dog, but on the space between them. He was watching the space where trust might grow. And Sophie, after all the years, after all the guilt, felt something inside her unlock. She hadn't said yes to the father. Not out loud. But maybe, just maybe, saying yes to the boy was enough. Every Sunday morning, like clockwork, Sophie arrived at the Wallace estate just as the dew was lifting from the hedges. The house sat at the edge of a quiet wooded street, more fortress than home, with tall iron gates and a driveway that wound like a private path through the trees. But despite its grandeur, it always felt a little cold. Until Peanut came padding down those halls with his tiny paws and yellow bandana. Ben would be waiting by the window. Not because anyone told him to, but because he wanted to. And for a boy who used to flinch at the sound of barking 3 blocks away, that was everything. The sessions weren't formal. No worksheets. No expectations. Just quiet games and gentleness. Sophie knew better than to rush trust. She started with something simple, tail taps. 3 tail taps and Peanut does his dance, she told Ben on their first Sunday. Ben tilted his head, skeptical. What kind of dance? You'll see. At first, he barely reached. His fingers would hover, then pull back just as quickly. But Peanut didn't move. He'd sit still, nose high, eyes half closed like he'd taken some secret vow of stillness. By the second week, Ben made contact, light, almost like a feather's touch. First once. Then again. On the third try, Peanut rolled sideways in an exaggerated flop, then kicked his legs into the air like a little clown dog, eyes still shut, tongue out in fake snores. Ben giggled. The sound was sudden and soft, so unfamiliar that even Sophie looked up. It wasn't loud. It didn't last long. But it was real. And it reached places in that house that no amount of money ever had. By the third Sunday, Ben began to ask questions. "Does Peanut like thunder?" he said, unprompted, while smoothing a blanket over the dog's back. Sophie looked up from the floor. "He used to be scared, but now he knows storms can't get him if he's got his blanket." Ben nodded slowly, processing every word. Then, "I don't like thunder. But I like Peanut's blanket." Peanut responded with a gentle wag, as if to say, "Yeah, me too, kid." Edward watched from the doorway. Always from a distance. Arms crossed, suit jacket still buttoned, even on weekends. He didn't interrupt. He never stepped in. But every Sunday he was there, silent, unmoving. And though he never said it aloud, something in him shifted the moment he saw his son walk calmly past the open window, even as a neighbor's dog barked in the distance. Ben didn't freeze. He didn't cry. He just kept walking, one hand brushing the hallway wall, the other gripping the soft corner of a blanket Peanut had left behind. In the stillness of those Sunday mornings, the walls of that grand estate began to soften. Not because of therapy or technology, but because a little boy learned that not all barks meant danger. That soft fur didn't have to mean pain. And that sometimes the safest thing in the world was a tiny dog with a nap schedule and a lopsided grin. "And Sophie?" She said less and less as the weeks went on. Because when healing finally arrives, you don't have to explain it. You just have to make space for it to stay. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, one of those in-between days when the house felt too quiet, and even the humming of the central air seemed too loud. Edward had just returned from a board meeting, his tie loosened, jacket over one shoulder, when he overheard a simple exchange in the kitchen. Ben was talking to Maria, the housekeeper who had been with the family since before his wife passed. The boy's voice was calm, almost casual. "If Peanut is my best friend," he said, "then Sophie's the one who understands me best." Maria chuckled softly, not thinking much of it. "She's very kind, Mijo." But Edward froze in the doorway. The words repeated in his mind on a loop, quiet but undeniable. "Sophie understands me best." He didn't walk into the room. He didn't say anything. Just turned slowly and stepped back into the hallway, where the polished wood floor seemed colder underfoot. It wasn't jealousy. Not exactly. Edward Wallace was a man who'd spent his entire adult life fixing things. Fixing broken systems. Broken contracts. Broken cities. But when it came to fixing the silence between himself and his son, he'd been running on empty for years. His methods, discipline, routine, security, had all failed him where it mattered most. And now, someone else had succeeded. He'd seen it happening over the past few weeks. Ben's shoulders relaxing. His laughter returning. The way he lit up when Sophie arrived. How his voice rose just enough to be heard when asking her questions. How his body leaned toward her without fear. How he reached for her hand the way he used to reach for his mother's. Edward didn't resent Sophie. He appreciated her. Admired her, even. But there was a part of him buried deep beneath decades of command and control that couldn't help but whisper, "If she's what he needs now, then what am I?" That night, he sat alone in his study. The lights dimmed low, a glass of untouched scotch on the table beside him. He opened his calendar and stared at the Sundays, each one marked with Sophie's name in tiny, precise letters. He hovered over the next one. Then the next. And slowly, deliberately, he began deleting them. When Maria brought Ben in for his bedtime story, Edward greeted his son with a smile. Asked how the day went. Listened to a short, distracted recounting of a new game he and Sophie had made up. But when Ben asked, "Is Sophie coming next week?" Edward cleared his throat. "Not every week," he said. "We're going to try something different. She'll still visit, just not as often." Ben's brow furrowed. "But we haven't finished teaching Peanut the high five." Edward smiled again, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You can show me." Maybe I can help. Ben didn't respond. Just turned over in bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. And in that silence, Edward felt it again, that ache of not being enough. Of trying too hard, too late. The next morning, he told Sophie they'd be moving to visits once every 2 weeks. He kept the message brief. Businesslike. Sophie didn't argue. She simply replied, "Let me know what works best for Ben." But Edward couldn't shake the feeling that, in trying to reclaim his place in his son's life, he may have just stepped further away. It was meant to be a simple afternoon picnic. Edward had planned it down to the last detail. Fresh sandwiches from Ben's favorite bakery, a quiet corner of the park where the trees gave just enough shade, and no other dogs in sight. He'd even checked with the groundskeepers beforehand. He wanted this to be something they could share, just father and son. But parks aren't boardrooms. And nature doesn't follow memos. They were laying out the blanket when it happened. A jogger, distracted by his phone, let his Great Dane stray too close. The dog caught sight of a squirrel, lunged forward, and let out a deep, thunderous bark. Ben's world collapsed in an instant. He screamed, a sound Edward hadn't heard in months, and stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the blanket and landing hard on the grass. His tiny hands covered his ears, his knees pulled up tight, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Edward rushed to him, dropping to the ground, arms outstretched. "Ben, it's okay. It's just a dog, it's not coming near us." But Ben didn't look at him. His eyes darted around frantically, and then he yelled, through sobs and panic, "Where's Sophie? Where's Sophie? I want Sophie." The words struck Edward like a hammer. Not Dad. Not help me. Just, Sophie. And before he could gather his son into his arms, someone nearby, perhaps a tourist, perhaps just someone nosy, lifted their phone and started filming. The clip went viral by nightfall. A 30-second video titled "Billionaire Can't Calm His Own Kid. Child Screams for Stranger Instead" ricocheted across social media. Commentators speculated, headlines dissected, and strangers with no context weighed in with judgments. Edward read every line. He didn't sleep that night. He barely breathed. By morning, the shame had morphed into something sharper, anger. He called Sophie. His voice was cold. Precise. The way it always was when he didn't want anyone to know he was bleeding inside. "I think we've crossed a line," he said. "My son is too attached. This isn't what I asked for." There was a long pause. Then her voice, quiet but steady, "He was scared." "I'm his father," Edward snapped. "And he didn't call for me. He called for you. What does that tell the world?" Sophie didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. So he ended the call. Then he contacted security. From that day forward, Sophie was not allowed on the property. No exceptions. No explanations to Ben. Just silence. 2 days later, a small package arrived at the Wallace home. It wasn't addressed to Edward. It wasn't wrapped in anything fancy. Just a folded square of fabric, Peanut's yellow bandana, and a handwritten note on the back of a napkin. It read, "It's never about choosing the cutest dog. It's about choosing the one who makes you believe it won't hurt you." Edward stared at the note for a long time, then set it down without a word. And for the first time since Sophie had entered their lives, the house felt colder than before. The house grew quiet again, but this time, it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that wrapped itself around the walls and stayed. No Peanut padding across the hardwood floors. No Sophie humming under her breath while tying a new scarf around the little dog's neck. Just the soft sounds of a boy retreating further into himself. Ben no longer asked to go outside. He no longer asked about the weather or counted the ducks from the window. He spent more time in his room, curled beneath his blanket, the yellow bandana once belonging to Peanut folded carefully beneath his pillow like a secret he couldn't let go of. Edward noticed, but didn't know how to reach him. He'd tried in his own way. Bought new books, offered extra screen time, even canceled a few meetings just to be home more. But nothing seemed to stick. Ben would nod, smile faintly. But the spark that Sophie had helped ignite in him, that fragile flickering warmth, had dimmed. Then one evening, Edward passed by his son's door and noticed the light still on. The boy was sitting at his small desk, completely focused. A pencil moved slowly across the paper, careful, deliberate strokes that made Edward pause in the doorway. Ben didn't see him watching. He was too immersed in the scene unfolding on the page, a dog sitting inside a circle, just like Peanut used to do. But what caught Edward's breath was what came next. Ben drew another figure beside the dog. Taller. Human. Sitting, not standing. Hands open. Shoulders relaxed. It was Edward. For a moment, the father couldn't move. He simply stood there, one hand on the doorframe, his heart tightening with a guilt that reached deeper than words ever could. Later that night, after tucking his son into bed, Edward pulled up a chair beside him. The room was dark except for the glow of a small nightlight shaped like a star. Ben's eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. Edward cleared his throat. "I saw your drawing." Ben turned his head slowly. Edward hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you want me to sit with you? Or with Peanut?" Ben blinked. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "I want both." Edward leaned closer. "Both." The boy nodded. "So I know," he said quietly, "that no one leaves if I get scared again." The room fell silent. But this time, it wasn't the heavy kind. It was a silence filled with understanding, raw, unfinished but real. Edward reached out and took his son's hand, feeling how small it still was, how tightly it curled into his. He didn't have the right words. He didn't have a plan. But in that moment, he knew one thing. His son wasn't asking for perfection. He was asking for presence. Not someone to replace Sophie. Not someone to fix everything. Just someone to stay when the fear came back. And this time, Edward vowed he would. It took Edward 3 days to find the courage to go. Not because he didn't know where Sophie was. Her new program had been quietly gaining attention across town, a community center repurposed into a therapy dog facility with soft lighting, floor cushions, and murals painted by children. The sign out front read, "Safe Paws, Healing Together." He stood outside for a long time, watching parents and kids come and go. Some children walked with assistance, others clung to their parents' hand. Every single one of them looked uncertain, until they stepped through the door. Edward took a breath. Then another. And finally, he stepped inside. The air was warm, filled with a gentle mix of lavender and dog shampoo. He could hear soft laughter coming from a back room, and the occasional excited bark that quickly hushed into silence, each sound layered with patience, not pressure. He didn't have an appointment. Didn't even plan on speaking. He just wanted to see. But then he saw her. Sophie stood near the center of the room, guiding a mother through a simple exercise, letting her young daughter place a treat into an open palm while a calm golden retriever waited nearby. Sophie's voice was steady, low, and full of trust. She hadn't changed, not really. Same scarf, same ease, same sense of stillness in motion. And sitting at the edge of the room, like he always had, was Peanut. His yellow bandana was faded now, frayed slightly at the corners. But he still wore it like a badge. As if he knew exactly what it meant. Edward didn't say a word. He crossed the room slowly, ignoring the cautious glances from a few nearby volunteers. His suit looked out of place here, too sharp, too pressed. But the moment he reached Peanut, he knelt. And placed his hand gently on the dog's head. Peanut blinked up at him, then gave a small silent wag, just once as if to say hello again. Edward's voice, when it came, was rough around the edges. Not loud. Not commanding. Just honest. "I'm learning too," he whispered, eyes locked on the floor. Just like him. Behind him, Sophie had turned. She didn't rush over. Didn't say anything clever. She just watched. And for the first time, Edward didn't see her as a rival, or a replacement, or even the person who'd stepped in when he felt most small. He saw her as a bridge. A woman who had knelt beside his son when he couldn't. A teacher, not just to Ben, but to him. When their eyes met, there was no need to rehash the past. No need to apologize for the space or the silence. This time, Sophie didn't have to lead the way. She simply stepped beside him, let the moment unfold, and watched as a father and a dog sat still together, two souls once strangers to softness, now sharing the quiet. And in that room filled with nervous energy and hope, Edward Wallace finally understood. He didn't have to fix everything. He just had to show up. It had started as an idea, small at first, almost fleeting, like a wish whispered in the dark. But with every passing week, it had grown into something bigger. Something that felt like the right thing at the right time. Sophie, Edward, and Ben had launched SafePaw together, a project born from the quiet strength of a father and son who had learned to trust, and a woman who had been the bridge between their fears. The goal was simple but profound: to help children with disabilities learn how to connect with animals, to face their fears with the same courage that Ben had shown. The community embraced it quickly. Parents, children, even the local press, they all rallied behind the cause. Sophie became the head trainer, leading workshops and training sessions, while Edward used his resources to provide everything the program needed: space, funding, outreach. But it was Ben who, more than anyone else, embodied the heart of it all. And it was Ben who, on the day of the SafePaw launch, took the first step that would change everything. The event was held at a local auditorium, a place where the light was soft and the air filled with quiet anticipation. Parents, teachers, and children filled the seats, many of them from the nearby schools, some with their children in tow, all hoping for a moment of connection, one that might help bridge the space between their world and the world of animals. Edward stood at the back of the room, his arms crossed, watching the crowd. He had his doubts, of course. Would this work? Could they really help these children? Was it all just a dream that would fade when the last child went home? But then Ben, holding Peanut's favorite dog biscuit, walked to the front of the stage. The auditorium fell silent. He was small on that stage, but his voice was steady as he addressed the crowd. "I used to be afraid of dogs," he said, his words echoing softly, yet with a courage that filled the room. "I used to run from them, cry when I heard them bark. But now," he paused, looking down at Peanut, who sat loyally beside him, wagging his tail. "Now, I'm not afraid. It's not because Peanut is different from other dogs. It's because I know when I'm scared, there's always someone there." Ben's eyes turned toward his father, who had stepped forward without a word. Then he looked at Sophie, standing quietly beside the stage. He smiled. "It's because someone is there when I need them. And that makes all the difference." The room stood still for a moment, then erupted into applause. Edward's heart swelled. He reached out to grab Ben's hand, pulling him close, squeezing it tight. It wasn't just a proud moment for a father. It was a moment of shared victory, a moment that spoke to the strength of not just the boy, but of the three of them, Edward, Sophie, and Ben, coming together in a way none of them had expected. Sophie stood at the back of the stage, watching. Her eyes were brimming with unshed tears, but there was a smile on her face. A smile that spoke of a journey taken, of lives changed, of fears faced and conquered. And then, for the first time, she allowed herself to cry, just a little. The applause filled the air, but it was the soft touch of a hand on her shoulder that caught her attention. Edward had moved from the crowd, standing beside her now, offering a quiet, understanding nod. Together, they watched as Ben, the boy who had once been paralyzed by fear, now stood in the light. Not as someone needing help, but as someone showing others the way. And in that room full of hopeful faces, with the scent of the dog biscuits and the sound of wagging tails in the background, it became clear. It wasn't just about teaching children to trust animals. It was about teaching everyone, including themselves, to trust again. If you believe that a simple, gentle touch can open a new door for a heart, go ahead and leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD to catch more heartwarming stories every week. Thank you for watching till the end. See you next time.